There are wars that echo in the world's memory: Normandy, Stalingrad, Iwo Jima. But some battles die in silence, their screams buried under the rubble of history. One such silence lies in the heart of the Philippines, in a city once called the Pearl of the Orient. Manila, a place of sunlight and song, of Spanish stone and American jazz, was destined to be free again in 1945. But the freedom that came did not wear the face of salvation. It came with fire, with steel, with the thunder of guns that shook the bay, and the smell of burning flesh that turned night into eternal day. The siege of Manila was not a victory, it was an unmaking. Over 100,000 civilians died in a single month, crushed between two armies, one desperate, one relentless, both blind to the people they destroyed. This is not just a story of war, it's a story of a city devoured by its own liberation, where freedom burned as bright as death. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Before the world tore itself apart in the 1940s, Manila stood quietly by the edge of the Pacific, basking in a warmth that was more than sunlight. The air itself seemed slow, heavy with the scent of salt and burning copra, with the murmurs of street vendors drifting through the archways of centuries-old buildings. The city was a blend of languages and memories: Tagalog spoken under Spanish balconies, English advertisements painted beside crumbling stone walls built by friars and soldiers. Every dawn the Pasig River glimmered like liquid gold as the first boats crept along its surface, carrying bananas, coconuts, rice and flowers bound for the markets that bloomed like living gardens within the heart of the old city. Intramuros, the walled city, stood as Manila's ancient heart, a fortress of coral stone and devotion. Within its thick sun-bleached walls, the echo of bells carried through narrow streets lined with convents, schools and courtyards shaded by mango trees. Beyond its gates the city sprawled outward, Binondo, Tondo, Ermita, districts humming with trade and laughter, with jeepneys and karamotas sharing cobbled lanes. The afternoons often melted into the amber haze of tropical rain, each droplet striking the tiled roofs like a slow rhythmic drumbeat that lulled the city into gentle stillness. Manila in those days was not merely a city, but a living symphony of time. Beneath the Spanish facades, beneath the American movie theaters and dance halls, beneath the carillons of churches built by Augustinian hands, there lingered something old, a soul that remembered colonization, revolution, and rebirth. It was a city both ancient and young, a place where schoolgirls in white uniforms crossed paths with veterans of forgotten wars, where the rich strolled through Luneta Park at sunset, and barefoot children played among the ruins of old garrisons swallowed by bougainvillea. There was an easy rhythm to life. The measured toll of church bells marking the hours, the distant honk of motor cars mingling with the calls of fishermen bringing in the morning's catch. In the evenings, when the sun sank behind the domes of San Agustin and the sky blushed purple and gold, the city glowed softly as though lit from within. Gentle breezes drifted from the bay, carrying whispers of faraway lands. Hong Kong, San Francisco, Madrid, places known to sailors and dreamers who gathered by the docks. Manila was both cosmopolitan and intimate, both weary and unbroken. In the cafes of Ermita, jazz from gramophones mixed with the smell of Barako coffee and rum. Waiters in pressed shirts served Americans and Filipinos alike, their laughter rising above the low hum of ceiling fans. At the Grand Manila Hotel, the pride of the East, the chandeliers threw gold upon the polished floors where officers and socialites waltzed, believing the world outside those doors would remain unchanged forever. From its verandas the city stretched into infinity, palm trees swaying, electric trams sliding along Taft Avenue, carriages rattling past the grand churches that watched like sentinels over the faithful. Beyond the city's charm lay its heart, the people who endured the long line of conquerors and still found reason to sing. The Filipinos of pre-war Manila were patient, warm and enduring, weaving resilience into every corner of daily life. Housewives swept the narrow alleys before dawn. Students walked to class with books bound in brown paper. Carpenters and craftsmen worked under the shade of nipa huts, the air thick with the sound of hammers and the smell of sawdust. On Sundays, the churches overflowed with families in their finest clothes, children clutching rosaries and women fanning themselves with woven abanico fans as priests spoke of hope, salvation, and faith. The nights were gentler still. From the bay one could watch ships drift toward the horizon, their lights flickering like stars upon the dark water. Lovers strolled beneath acacia trees, their voices blending with the slow creak of oars from fishermen returning home. Across the city, the faint echo of music, a violin here, a piano there, carried through open windows, soft and slow, as though the city itself was singing a lullaby to the sea. Manila had been called the Pearl of the Orient not merely for its beauty, but for its balance, a delicate harmony of East and West, of tradition and progress. The Spanish left their stone and faith, the Americans brought electricity, cinema, and the illusion of modern peace. Beneath them both, the Filipino soul endured, unbowed, steady, patient. The world beyond its shores trembled with war, but in Manila, time still felt kind, the days golden and endless. And yet, even in that warmth, small shadows began to stretch. Ships moved across distant seas, rumors whispered through the docks, of Japan rising, of territories falling. Newspapers carried headlines of Europe in flames, and in the consulates, radios crackled with voices warning of a storm moving east. Still, the people of Manila went about their days, trusting that their island's peace would hold. The evenings remained tranquil, the sunsets eternal, and the laughter of children unbroken. For a fleeting moment in history, Manila was perfect, serene and unsuspecting, unaware that soon its graceful streets would echo not with bells and laughter, but with screams and the thunder of artillery. The coral walls of Intramuros would soon tremble. The Pasig would soon carry not flowers, but ash. The pearl of the Orient shone brightest just before it shattered. The year was 1941, and the Pacific air carried something new, not the scent of salt or jasmine, but the faint electric tension that precedes a storm. In Manila, mornings still began in golden calm, the sun pouring over the tiled roofs of Ermita and the tranquil courtyards of Intramuros. Vendors still called out their wares in lilting voices, caramatas still rolled along the cobbled lanes, and fishermen still pulled their nets through the grey-blue shimmer of Manila Bay. Yet, under that familiar rhythm, something fragile had begun to tremble. Across the Pacific, Japan's empire spread outward like ink on parchment. China bled beneath its occupation. French Indochina bent under its weight, and whispers traveled from Hong Kong and Singapore of fleets gathering in shadowed harbors. The people of Manila heard these stories in the same way one hears the distant growl of thunder on a bright day, uneasy, yet too far away to believe it will ever break overhead. Newspapers on Avenida Rizal carried cautious headlines. Tensions in the Pacific. U.S. demands withdrawal from Indochina. The words felt foreign, unreal, as if belonging to another continent's misfortune. Still, the soldiers at Fort Santiago trained longer, the American patrols along the bay became more frequent, and the sound of airplanes sometimes split the silence of noon. At the Manila Hotel, generals and diplomats dined beneath chandeliers, their conversations careful but weighted. Douglas MacArthur, the tall, polished figure who had become the face of American command in the Philippines, moved through the halls with quiet authority. His plan was to turn the islands into a fortress, a shining bastion of American strength in Asia. But even he could feel the tightening pressure of time. Supplies arrived late. Reinforcements never came. The United States, still at peace, hesitated at the edge of war, and the islands lay exposed, glittering like jewels in the path of an approaching blade. Yet outside the garrisons, life went on as though the world were not changing. The cafes of Ermita still hummed with laughter, the bands still played swing music, and the streets glowed soft beneath the new electric lamps. American officers and Filipino families mingled in movie theaters, showing the latest Hollywood films, their minds briefly carried away to places where wars were just scripts and heroes never died. School children recited lessons under the watchful eyes of nuns, merchants counted pesos under paper lanterns, and fishermen still sang to the rhythm of the waves. The city refused to surrender its peace, even as it began to sense its own fragility. But in the quiet hours before dawn, Manila began to listen differently. The radio towers along Dewey Boulevard carried voices that spoke of Japanese convoys and shifting alliances. The newspapers printed maps showing arrows and borders, though few cared to understand them. In the bars along Taft Avenue, American soldiers whispered of coming orders, of the Japanese fleet that might be headed south, of the possibility that Manila could soon become the front line of something far greater than anyone imagined. By mid-year, the signs were unmistakable. The docks buzzed with military traffic. Civilians were asked to ration fuel. The once leisurely movements of ships in the bay became rigid, purposeful. Air raid drills began in schools. Sirens tested their wails through the streets, startling pigeons into sudden flight. The government assured its people that all was under control, that the Philippines was safe under the protection of the American flag. And yet, in the eyes of shopkeepers and soldiers alike, there lingered that same quiet question: what if the storm does not turn away? In the provinces beyond Manila, farmers noticed new uniforms on the roads, soldiers moving supplies toward Bataan, engineers laying down airstrips. The islands seemed to hum with hidden preparation. Yet every evening, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the city exhaled again, as if to say, not yet. The glow of the bay lights returned. Couples strolled along the promenade. Children played near the seawall, throwing pebbles into the dark water. The illusion of safety remained tenderly, stubbornly intact. But even illusions have shadows. On December nights, the sky over the Pacific deepened into a color too still to be peaceful. Somewhere far away, ships were already moving. In Tokyo, decisions were being sealed with ink and silence. The Philippines lay like an unwitting threshold between empires, a place that would soon be neither colony nor free nation, but battleground. Manila, the pearl of the Orient, rested in that fragile pause before impact, beautiful, oblivious, suspended between the glow of civilization and the darkness gathering just beyond its sight. In the final weeks of peace, the city was almost too lovely. The air smelled of rain and sea, the trees whispered in the soft winds from the bay, and from the grand hotels came the sound of piano music, graceful and unhurried. It was a beauty sharpened by impermanence, a moment that would never return once the first bombs fell. The people of Manila did not know that their quiet December dawns were already numbered. Soon the sky itself would open. It began with the sound, a deep, metallic hum that rose from the sky like the approach of some enormous unseen beast. On the morning of December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor burned half a world away, that hum came to Manila. The people looked upward from markets, from schools, from windows still heavy with the scent of coffee and bread. They saw sunlight glinting off distant wings, silver specks moving in perfect formation. For a heartbeat, they were beautiful, strange shimmering birds against the pale tropical sky. Then the sirens began. What followed was chaos draped in thunder. Japanese bombers, sleek and methodical, passed over the city in waves. The first explosions struck Nichols Field, then Cavite, then the harbor, thunder that tore the morning apart. From the decks of ships in Manila Bay, sailors watched black pillars of smoke rise like mountains, spreading outward across the sky. Glass shattered in every district. Churches that had withstood centuries of storms trembled under the concussion of falling steel. People ran without knowing where to go, clutching children, crossing themselves, crying out to saints whose stone faces stared down from trembling altars. The air became a living thing, hot, thick, and filled with the scent of oil and burning rubber. Columns of smoke twisted upward into the wind, turning day into a strange, choking dusk. Soldiers rushed through the streets, shouting orders that no one could hear over the constant roar of engines and the rhythmic scream of the sirens. Along Dewey Boulevard, families fled toward the bay, believing the open air would be safer, but there was no safety, not in the markets, not in the churches, not even beneath the earth where the lucky few hid in cellars as the city above began to come apart. For years Manila had believed itself untouchable, a civilized outpost of America's promise in the east. But that illusion burned quickly. The US Asiatic Fleet, unprepared and outmatched, began its withdrawal. In the corridors of Malacañang Palace, officials whispered of retreat and surrender, of the impossible task of defending an archipelago against an empire. General Douglas MacArthur, tall and implacable, faced the unthinkable, abandoning the capital. He watched from his headquarters as the horizon turned red. The Japanese advance from the north was relentless. Luzon's fields already churning under tank treads, its skies swarming with aircraft that moved as though they owned the wind itself. By late December, the city's defenders fell back toward Bataan and Corregidor, two narrow blades of land that guarded the entrance to the bay. There they would make their stand, not to save Manila, but to buy time. Inside the city, the news spread quickly. Manila was to be declared an open city, no resistance, no defense, in theory a gesture of mercy, meant to spare it from destruction. Posters appeared overnight, proclaiming neutrality. American troops withdrew. The government fled south to Corregidor, where MacArthur's staff set up their last fortress beneath the island's rock. The capital, they said, would be left untouched. But war does not honor gestures. On the morning of December 26, Japanese planes returned. They flew low, ignoring the declarations of neutrality, ignoring the red crosses painted on hospital roofs. The first bombs fell on the port, the next on the crowded district of Tondo, where homes of wood and palm leaf burst into flames like paper. The people had barely begun to rebuild from the first attacks. Now they simply fled. Rivers of humanity moving through the streets, silent except for the crying of children and the distant whine of aircraft circling overhead. The city that once sang now spoke in the language of fire. Entire blocks vanished overnight. The Pasig River ran black with soot, its surface broken by debris, a child's shoe, a door, a rosary, the charred timbers of what had been a home. The smell of burning filled every breath. From the walls of Intramuros, priests stood helplessly watching the sky, their prayers drowned by the howl of destruction. Bells that had once rung for weddings and baptisms, now tolled to warn of death. And then in January 1942, the occupation began. Japanese troops entered Manila through the northern gates, their boots echoing on stone streets still warm from the fires. They came in orderly columns, rifles gleaming, eyes cold. The American and Filipino defenders were gone. The city offered no resistance, only its silence. The red and white flag of the rising sun rose over government buildings, its folds catching the same wind that once carried the stars and stripes. The transformation was total and immediate. In a single month, Manila had moved from laughter to smoke, from civilization to surrender. MacArthur, now entrenched in Bataan, looked back across the bay from a distant ridge and saw the faint plume of smoke still curling from the capital. His duty bound him to hold the line, to delay the inevitable. Yet he knew what had been lost, not just a city, but a symbol. Manila had been the bright face of American influence in Asia, the pearl polished by decades of empire, and now it was in enemy hands. Inside the ruined streets, those who remained learned to adapt. The survivors, families without homes, workers without employers, soldiers without orders, hid what they could, whispered in corners, and waited. The world they had known was gone, replaced by soldiers who barked commands in a foreign tongue. The city that once glowed under sunlight now existed in half-light, its churches hollowed, its markets bare, its spirit waiting in the shadows for something that resembled peace. But peace would not come for 3 long years. The fall of Manila was not an ending but a descent. the first step into a darkness that would thicken until it blotted out everything familiar. In the months to come, hunger would take the streets, fear would become the city's new rhythm, and somewhere, across the Pacific, new armies were already gathering, promising liberation, though none could yet imagine what price that word would come to carry. The pearl of the Orient had fallen. What remained was the shell, empty, scorched, and waiting. When the guns finally stopped, there was no victory, only a silence so complete it seemed to press against the skin. The Japanese occupation settled over Manila not like a storm, but like the dust that follows one slow, choking, inescapable. It gathered in corners and underfoot, in the folds of curtains, in the lungs of the city itself. The air, once filled with the hum of radios and the laughter of cafes, became dense with watchfulness. People spoke in whispers, if at all, and learned to measure every word as though speech itself had become dangerous. The old banners were taken down, the American flag folded away in fear or defiance. In its place, the red sun rose on cloth banners that hung from government buildings and tram stops, their rays spreading across walls pocked with bullet holes. Soldiers marched in formation down the avenues of a conquered city, their steps timed, their rifles gleaming under the same sun that once warmed parades of Boy Scouts and college bands. Along the boulevards, posters appeared overnight, Japanese text beside strange drawings, urging obedience, discipline, gratitude. To the people who could not read them, the meaning was clear enough. The American garrisons were empty now, their gates chained, their windows shattered. Some were turned into headquarters, others into prisons. Intramuros, the city within walls filled with the heavy tread of foreign boots. The churches were left standing, though their bells no longer rang. Even faith seemed subdued, its symbols tolerated but watched. Priests carried on their rituals in hushed tones, their faces pale in the candlelight. They prayed not for victory anymore, but for endurance, for the strength to make it to the next day, without another name disappearing into the night. Life reorganized itself around fear. Curfews came first. Dusk became the border between existence and risk. By 7 in the evening, the streets emptied, shutters were drawn, and lamps were dimmed. The faintest sound could summon attention. Patrols passed regularly, the echo of their boots cutting through the stillness. Families huddled in rooms where the only light came from candles hidden behind makeshift screens. They learned to keep the radios silent, to listen instead for distant footsteps or the knock that might change everything. Food grew scarce almost immediately. The markets, once fragrant with fish and fruit, offered little beyond rice when rice could be found. Prices climbed beyond imagination. People bartered whatever they had left. Jewelry for bread, clothes for grain, books for a few ounces of oil. Many went hungry, some starved. On the outskirts of the city, gardens appeared where lawns once were, tiny squares of survival fenced by bamboo. Every meal became a victory, every rumor of a supply truck an event. And yet, even amid deprivation, Manila retained traces of its old grace. The river still flowed, though slower, murkier. Children still played, though quietly, inventing games that made no sound. The churches remained open during daylight, and within their cool stone walls the weary knelt beside flickering candles that smelled faintly of beeswax and smoke. Hope became smaller, more private, a hidden ember carried carefully through each day. Those who resisted did so in the margins. Leaflets appeared at night, brief and handwritten, warning of atrocities, whispering of guerrilla fighters in the provinces. The Japanese secret police hunted them with clinical precision. Interrogation centers became urban myths, places people spoke of only in euphemisms. To be taken there was to vanish. The city learned to look away, to swallow its grief in silence. For 3 long years, Manila lived like this, between breath and whisper, under the weight of an occupation that promised order, but delivered only obedience. School children learned new songs, their verses laced with propaganda. Newspapers printed words approved by censors, lines of ink that never told the truth. Theaters showed films extolling the empire's benevolence, and the audience clapped because not clapping might be noticed. Behind the masks of compliance, people waited. They waited through the heat, through the hunger, through the endless monotony of survival. There were moments when it almost seemed normal again. A breeze from the bay might carry the smell of salt and memory, a reminder of the Manila that once was. A mother might hum an old lullaby while her child slept, pretending for a few precious minutes that the world outside her window had not changed. The sunsets were still beautiful, crimson and gold, though now they looked like omens. Freedom had not vanished with a scream, as people feared. It had slipped away quietly, in increments too small to notice until it was gone. The shuttered shop, the missing neighbor, the word one dared not speak aloud. The loss was slow and methodical, like the fading of a photograph left too long in the sun. Manila became a city of shadows, its people learning to live half visible, half silent, always listening for the sound that would mean danger had found them. And still, life continued. The city's heart beat faintly beneath the boots and banners, sustained by memory and endurance. In secret, some kept old photographs of the city before the fall, as if the images themselves could preserve what was lost. In the dark corners of the walled city, candles flickered for those who would never return. Manila endured, but it was not the same city anymore. The pearl of the Orient had not shattered, it had been buried, layer by layer, beneath the weight of occupation. The dust of silence settled over everything, waiting for the day when the wind would rise again and sweep it clean. By 1943, the Japanese occupation had seeped into every layer of Manila's being, reshaping it in quiet, relentless ways. The city, once alive with laughter and color, now existed in subdued tones, the gray of rationed mornings, the yellow-brown of old rice, the dim, flickering glow of lamps lit early before the curfew hour. The occupation was no longer an interruption. It had become the air people breathed, the rhythm by which they measured time. Children too young to remember another world played in the ruins of buildings once owned by merchants and families long gone. They built toy guns from bamboo sticks, imitating soldiers they saw every day on the streets. Their laughter, though real, sounded different, hesitant, thinner, as if shaped by caution. In the afternoons they stopped their games when the soldiers passed, bowing automatically, their small bodies stiff with fear they didn't yet understand. The soldiers, some barely older than the boys they frightened, walked with a kind of cold formality, rifles slung, bayonets gleaming in the tropical light. Some ignored the children entirely, others tossed candy or barked a word in Japanese that no one understood. For the adults, each day was an act of endurance. Curfew had carved the city's pulse into narrow hours of daylight. At dusk, a bell or siren marked the moment when life retreated indoors, windows darkened. The streets fell silent, except for the echo of patrol boots and the occasional low hum of a passing truck. To be caught outside after curfew was to vanish, no trial, no record. It was a rule understood in every household, spoken of rarely, obeyed without question. The markets, stripped of their abundance, became places of quiet desperation. Tables once heavy with fruit, fish, and sugar now offered handfuls of rice, wilted vegetables, and goods smuggled under the eyes of soldiers. People bartered in whispers, trading family heirlooms for food. A golden wedding ring might buy a week's worth of grain. A silk dress could be exchanged for a bottle of cooking oil. Hunger was not sudden but steady, a tightening thread that bound every family together in shared fatigue. Mothers learned to stretch every grain, to cook soup from bones and salt, to hide what little they had from both soldiers and neighbors who might be forced to inform. Yet even within that starvation, life found strange continuities. Schools reopened, their curriculums rewritten under the watchful eye of the occupation government. Children learned new songs praising the benevolent empire, words that stuck awkwardly in their mouths. Teachers, some sincere, others afraid, repeated phrases about Asian unity while glancing at the back of the classroom, where soldiers sometimes stood, observing. Newspapers spoke of harmony, cooperation, and progress. Their headlines, a carefully arranged fiction. The truth lived elsewhere, in rumors traded in barbershops and churches, in the smuggled messages passed between trusted hands after dark. Some Filipinos chose to cooperate, believing survival required submission. Businessmen aligned with the new order to protect their wealth. Clerks worked under the puppet government, stamping documents in offices hung with the flag of the rising sun. Others resisted in quieter ways, a priest hiding guerrilla couriers in the church cellar, a young woman slipping coded notes into loaves of bread, a mother passing news between neighbors through the safety of prayer. Manila became a city of secrets. Every smile, every silence could conceal allegiance or betrayal. Trust grew fragile. Even family bonds strained beneath suspicion. Still, small rebellions persisted. Hidden radios carried faint, static-filled voices from the BBC or from American stations far across the sea. People gathered around them at night, lights extinguished, breath held, listening for names, for MacArthur's voice, for any sign that the Allies remembered them. Each whispered broadcast became a spark, a reminder that the world beyond the bay was still turning. Hope lived quietly in those darkened rooms, fragile yet stubborn, refusing to die, even as the city's walls seemed to press inward. The occupation pressed hardest on the body, hunger, exhaustion, and the constant hum of fear. But it also gnawed at memory. Many began to forget what Manila had looked like before the war. The sound of swing music, the scent of coffee drifting through America cafes, the bright Sunday dresses along Dewey Boulevard, all these seemed distant, belonging to another lifetime. Now the city's soundtrack was the bark of commands, the clatter of wooden shoes, the occasional cry that broke the night before being swallowed by silence again. Yet in odd ways, beauty still survived. The sunsets over Manila Bay were the same, wide, slow, drenched in crimson and gold. Even the soldiers sometimes paused to watch, their silhouettes outlined against the glow. Lovers still met in secret corners, clutching at moments of tenderness as if to defy the ruin around them. In the markets, a flower seller might still tuck a sampaguita blossom behind her ear, its fragrance defiant against the stench of smoke and sweat. Beneath it all, the city was changing, not just in its appearance but in its soul. The easy laughter of pre-war Manila was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt permanent. People learned to read gestures instead of words, to recognize danger in the flicker of a soldier's glance, to sense when a street was not safe to cross. The city had become one enormous stage of watchful eyes, where every move could be noted, every mistake could cost a life. Still, life went on, because it had to. Babies were born, marriages took place in dim churches with paper flowers and whispered vows. Funerals passed with few mourners and no music. The calendar advanced. Beneath the flag of the rising sun, Manila endured not through courage or defiance, but through a kind of patient, exhausted faith that one day the tide would turn again. And far out in the Pacific, unseen by the people who prayed for deliverance, that tide was indeed turning. The Allied forces were gathering strength. Fleets assembled, armies trained, and plans were drawn in secret rooms thousands of miles away. The storm that had once come from the north was preparing to return from the east, this time with fire greater than the first. For now, though, Manila remained in its uneasy stillness. Beautiful, wounded, waiting. Its people rose each morning to bow beneath the red sun, each evening to whisper the same prayer that the coming freedom, whenever it arrived, would be gentler than the last invasion had been. None could yet imagine that when liberation came, it would come burning. By the waning months of 1944, the air above Manila began to feel different, not yet free, but stirred, as if the very winds from the Pacific were carrying whispers of an approaching reckoning. The Japanese soldiers in their khaki uniforms seemed sharper, more alert, their tempers brittle. Civilians noticed the change in their movements, the longer patrols, the tighter checkpoints, the sudden bursts of violence that came without reason. It was as though an invisible tide had begun to turn, and even those who tried not to hope could feel its pull in their bones. Far to the southeast, on the island of Leyte, thunder had already begun. The sea itself trembled under the weight of American fleets, ships that stretched to the horizon, their decks bristling with planes and guns. In October, the voice of General Douglas MacArthur, once a memory carried through static and rumor, returned through the crackle of shortwave radios. People of the Philippines, I have returned. For those in Manila, those words struck like the first toll of a great bell, reverberating through the silence of occupation. Deliverance had a sound now, the low, relentless hum of engines across the sea. But hope, after years of hunger and fear, was no longer pure. It came twisted with dread. Liberation, they knew, would not come gently. It would arrive in fire. The Japanese had fortified the city beyond recognition, dugouts beneath schools, machine guns in church towers, ammunition stacked in the crypts of old Spanish cathedrals. They had declared Manila a military stronghold, a city to be defended to the last man. In the north, the Philippine resistance, the Hukbolahap, and other guerrilla bands stirred from the jungles and hills. They had fought in the shadows for years, stealing supplies, assassinating collaborators, passing intelligence to the Americans through hidden radios. Now, as the Allies moved closer, their messages grew urgent. They reported Japanese troop movements, the construction of barricades, the sudden burning of entire villages suspected of aiding the resistance. From the outskirts of Pampanga to the edges of Laguna, the landscape began to smell of gunpowder again. In Manila itself, the city felt as if it were holding its breath. The great boulevards, Taft Avenue, Dewey Boulevard, once filled with carriages and bicycles, now carried columns of Japanese trucks rumbling toward the southern defenses. The old walls of Intramuros, built by Spanish hands centuries before, were turned into fortresses once more. The ancient city, shaped by centuries of trade and faith, was being prepared for war. Even the Grand Manila Cathedral, its dome rising above the rooftops, now stood surrounded by sandbags and gun emplacements. Rumors flowed like underground rivers. Some said the Americans were already in Mindoro, others claimed they had landed in Batangas. Each whisper carried both hope and terror, because the closer the liberators came, the more violently the occupiers clung to control. Curfews grew harsher. Arrests multiplied. The Kempeitai, Japan's military police, prowled the neighborhoods with lists of names. Anyone suspected of aiding the resistance vanished into interrogation chambers, from which few returned. Torture was no longer a secret, but a presence that haunted the city's nights. And yet, in the faint blue hours before dawn, people still dreamed. They dreamed of open streets again, of bread without ration cards, of the sight of American soldiers marching down Escolta with flags unfurled. The old songs, the swing tunes once banned by the occupiers, returned in whispers, hummed under one's breath while drawing water or cooking rice. Even the simplest acts took on a quiet defiance, a flag hidden under a floorboard, a prayer said in English, a small child taught to say liberation like a secret promise. By Christmas of 1944, distant flashes on the horizon hinted that the war was coming closer. Some said they could hear artillery in the wind, others that the ground itself vibrated faintly at night. For the first time in years, people looked to the sky with something other than fear, but the Japanese too looked upward, and they saw their empire collapsing. Their command in Manila grew desperate. They began to retreat north toward the mountains, leaving behind smaller and more fanatical units within the city. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who commanded the defense of the Philippines, had already ordered the evacuation of Manila, intending to spare it from destruction. But his subordinates in the city, particularly the naval forces under Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, refused. Bound by honor, pride, and the fatal logic of militarism, they decided that surrender was dishonor, and that Manila would be defended to the death. They fortified the government buildings, the university, the hospitals, the convents. They set up snipers in bell towers, mined bridges, and filled tunnels with explosives. The soldiers stationed there were told they would die in place. Civilians, caught in between, began to understand what that meant. By January 1945, the horizon over the bay glowed with a faint orange pulse, distant bombardments on Luzon's southern coast. American forces were pushing northward, island by island, and Manila was next. Refugees from the countryside began to pour into the city, bringing stories of battles, of villages bombed, of the thunder of tanks rolling through fields. They came with what little they could carry: blankets, photographs, the memory of homes already gone. In the evenings, Manila's people stood by their darkened windows and watched the far-off flashes of light over the sea. It was said that when the wind was right, one could hear the muffled roll of artillery from the beaches where the Americans had landed. Some called it the sound of salvation, others thought it sounded too much like the beginning of the end. The city's mood became one of stillness edged with tremor, like the moment before a typhoon's eye collapses, when even the birds fall silent. Markets no longer opened. Churches filled not with hymns but with whispered confessions. People began to bury their valuables in gardens, to write the names of family members on scraps of paper in case they were separated. Even laughter felt dangerous, too loud for a city listening for the first roar of guns. The Japanese command began moving its prisoners, Americans, Filipinos, and other civilians, into tighter enclosures, as if preparing for something unspeakable. The Santo Tomas University, once a place of learning, was now an internment camp, its walls hung with barbed wire. Inside, men and women waited, hollow-eyed, for a deliverance that might kill them in saving them. Outside, the last of the city's lights were extinguished. The rising sun flags faded in the smoke-stained air. The wide streets lay empty except for soldiers digging trenches beneath the banyan trees and machine gun nests hidden in school courtyards. The great city that had once glittered like a gem by the bay now lay still, crouched in shadow, waiting for the war to arrive. And then, one dawn in February, Manila awoke to the far rolling thunder of artillery, not distant anymore, but near enough to rattle the windows. Liberation had come, just as promised, but with it came the fire. By the first days of February 1945, Manila no longer resembled a city waiting for liberation. It had become a fortress, silent and poisoned by preparation. Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 31st Naval Special Base Force, knew he was disobeying a direct order from General Yamashita. Yamashita had ordered the evacuation of Manila to preserve it from ruin, to regroup his men in the mountain strongholds to the north. But Iwabuchi had made a different decision, a decision steeped in the feverish loyalty of a man who could not imagine surrender. His ships had already been sunk in the harbor months before. His pride, his duty, and his shame fused into one terrible resolve. If the city was to fall, it would fall in fire, and he would fall with it. His command numbered roughly 17,000 men, naval infantry, marines, and scattered army units, joined by fanatical auxiliaries. They were trapped within the capital's heart, but instead of retreating, they began to dig in. They turned Manila, once the radiant pearl of the Orient, into a tomb. The transformation began quietly. One morning, civilians awoke to find the streets barricaded with felled trees, sandbags, and iron rails wrenched from the tram lines. Entire intersections were blocked by makeshift bunkers built from bricks torn out of shattered homes. The bridges that spanned the Pasig River, those elegant crossings that once carried lovers, carriages, and schoolchildren, were now wired with explosives. Beneath their arches, barrels of fuel and boxes of dynamite lay hidden, waiting for the right spark. Iwabuchi's men worked day and night. They commandeered churches, convents, schools, and hospitals, buildings that had stood for centuries as sanctuaries, and filled them with machine guns and mortars. The ancient walls of Intramuros, built in the age of galleons and muskets, now bristled with artillery emplacements. Bell towers became sniper nests. The narrow alleys between convents were strung with barbed wire, turning the holy city into a labyrinth of death. Inside these strongpoints, Japanese soldiers prepared for annihilation. They built underground chambers, dug tunnels through cellars, filled cisterns with munitions. In the grand halls of the University of Santo Tomas, where students once debated and studied under the Spanish friars, men now stacked crates of grenades beside blackboards still chalked with forgotten lessons. In the ornate chambers of the city hall, Heavy machine guns were mounted behind marble columns, the walls pocked with firing slits. The opulent government buildings, the legislative building, the post office, the finance bureau, were all transformed into redoubts, each to be defended to the last cartridge. Iwabuchi's engineers were meticulous. Mines were buried beneath cobblestones, under staircases, in courtyards where children had once played. Even doorways were trapped. A single step could trigger a hidden explosive. The soldiers learned to fight not for victory but for spectacle, for the glory of dying hard enough to delay the enemy. In their minds, the siege would be their final act of devotion to an empire already collapsing. The civilians trapped within the city could only watch as their world was dismantled around them. Families who refused to abandon their homes were evicted at bayonet point. Convents filled with refugees became occupied by troops. The nuns of Santa Catalina, the priests of San Agustin, the sisters of St. Paul, all were forced to share their cloisters with armed men who tore down crucifixes to mount machine guns in their place. Those who protested disappeared into the cellars or were executed quietly in courtyards where the echo of gunshots mingled with the tolling of bells. At night, the city glowed dimly with the orange light of torches. The Japanese soldiers, driven by desperation and the dark ecstasy of their cause, sang battle songs as they worked. The sound carried through the shuttered streets, rhythmic, haunting, rising and falling with the crash of hammers and the clatter of shovels. From the rooftops one could see their silhouettes moving against the sky, setting traps beneath the moonlight. In the basements of schools, they stored ammunition beside barrels of gasoline. In hospitals, they positioned mortars between beds. The idea of sacred space, of mercy, dissolved entirely. Even the dead were no longer spared. Cemeteries were mined, tombs cracked open to serve as storage for shells. The old Spanish crypts beneath Intramuros, once filled with the remains of priests and poets, now echoed with the metallic clank of weapons being prepared for a battle that would not distinguish between soldier and civilian. Iwabuchi himself moved through the city like a ghost, his face drawn and pale. Those who served near him said he spoke little, his voice cold, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He was haunted by the loss of his fleet at Leyte Gulf, an admiral without ships, a commander without a future. Perhaps that was why he resolved to make Manila his monument, his final offering to a war that had already devoured everything he loved. He knew the Americans would come with overwhelming force, that the outcome was inevitable. But in the twisted logic of a warrior culture that worshipped death before defeat, inevitability was no excuse for surrender, it was an invitation to martyrdom. By the last week of January, the city was fully trapped. Thousands of civilians still lived within its limits, too afraid to flee or unable to pass through the tightening cordon. The roads leading north were blocked by Japanese checkpoints. Those who tried to escape were often turned back or shot. Families huddled in basements with sacks of rice, whispering prayers to saints whose statues now stared down from church altars, surrounded by ammunition. The air smelled of oil and sweat and gunmetal. Every sound, the creak of a shutter, the cry of a child, could draw suspicion. The city waited, listening to the far-off sound of artillery from the southern outskirts. Each day the rumble grew louder. Each night more soldiers passed through the streets, their faces lit by the glow of torches, their rifles slung across their backs like extensions of their will. Some drank openly, muttering about death and honor. Others sat in silence, polishing their bayonets, their hands trembling slightly. By now every bridge over the Pasig was rigged to explode. The Ayala Bridge, the Jones Bridge, the Quezon Bridge, all were marked for destruction. The city was no longer meant to survive. It was meant to take as many with it as possible. From the air the pattern of defense was visible even through the haze, concentric circles of fire waiting to ignite. The inner walled city of Intramuros was the core, a medieval heart fortified for a modern hell. Beyond it stretched a maze of barricades, canals, and ruins ready to swallow anyone who entered. In the hidden courtyards of Malat, in the narrow lanes of Tondo, In the grand avenues of Ermita, the same preparations unfolded. Homes were gutted, staircases dismantled, walls hollowed out for gunfire. What had once been a living city was now an instrument of death, its arteries clogged with explosives, its veins filled with men who no longer planned to see another sunrise. The civilians could only pray. Some clung to the belief that the Americans would come quickly, that the siege would end before it began. Others, older and wiser, understood the truth. Manila was about to be devoured from within. Liberation would come, yes, but liberation now had teeth, and far beyond the city's trembling edges, the thunder of American guns grew louder with each passing hour. By early February of 1945, the rumble of the American advance had reached the outskirts of Manila, a low, constant vibration that vibrated through the bones of the city itself. 6th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, had pushed northward from Leyte, moving island by island with overwhelming force, their landing crafts now replaced by tanks, artillery and infantry trucks that trundled through the Philippine countryside like thunder rolling over hills. Manila, which had once basked in the warm glow of sunlight and laughter, now waited with a sinister patience, its streets hollowed and bristling, its every corner a trap. The first armored columns entered the outer districts, Malate, Ermita and Santa Cruz, their engines growling and treads grinding against streets worn smooth by centuries of trade and procession. Soldiers, hardened by months of combat in jungles thick with rain, snakes and malaria, expected resistance. Yes, but they expected a city still alive with its people, perhaps to be greeted with cheers, flags, and the faint smile of liberation. Instead, Manila offered them silence first, then sudden flashes of violence, a city transformed into a battleground. Sniper fire erupted without warning from shattered roofs and bell towers. The grand churches, once symbols of sanctuary and faith, now concealed machine guns that cut down squads in seconds. Civilians crouched in the rubble, some frozen in fear, others hiding bodies already lost to the initial shelling. The streets were mined. Cobblestones had been lifted and wired to explode under the weight of American vehicles, alleys rigged with booby traps, entire buildings prepared to collapse like paper in the right moment. The scent of powder and scorched concrete filled the air. Dust rose in choking clouds, settling over the faces of men who had long thought themselves immune to the violence of urban warfare. The tanks moved slowly, methodical, scraping over the debris of homes and barricades, their guns sweeping open plazas now deserted. Soldiers advanced cautiously, scanning every window, every doorway, every balcony. Some buildings had been gutted from the inside, floors hollowed out to trap those who dared enter. Others were rigged with flamethrowers and hidden explosives, ready to incinerate anyone who stepped across their thresholds. The very architecture of Manila had been weaponized, each colonial facade turned against the invaders, each narrow alley a labyrinth of death. In Malate, American troops found a once bustling neighborhood, now silent, but for the occasional scream or the faint shuffle of someone moving through the wreckage. Civilian bodies lay among the ruins, men, women, children, victims of starvation, gunfire, or the mines laid in the streets. The soldiers had been trained for the jungles of New Guinea and Leyte, but the urban landscape of Manila was another challenge entirely. Every step forward required calculation, patience, and the grim acknowledgement that the city itself was the enemy as much as the men defending it. By the second week of February, artillery from American positions on the bay and surrounding hills began to pound Japanese strongpoints. The flash of shells overhead was followed by the deep, reverberating boom that shook even the sturdier buildings of Intramuros. The Japanese had dug into every stone, every abandoned school, every gutted hospital, and the response was methodical. Sniper fire picked off observers on rooftops. Hidden machine guns cut down squads trying to cross open plazas. The roar of the city, artillery, gunfire, and human cries replaced the silence of occupation with something far louder and more terrifying. Yet, in spite of it all, the soldiers pressed on. American infantry moved house by house, street by street, often encountering booby traps that left shattered corpses and smoking rubble behind them. Engineers followed closely, disarming mines, cutting wires, and marking buildings too dangerous to enter. The civilians who had remained were caught between two forces, the advancing liberators and the desperate fanatical Japanese defenders. Many tried to flee alongside the Americans when possible, while others hid in the shadows, terrified that any movement would attract the attention of either side. The psychological weight of the advance was heavy. Men who had faced bullets and shrapnel in jungles now found themselves navigating a city turned entirely into a killing ground. The streets of Manila, once a network of life, commerce and laughter, were now cages lined with death. The smell of rotting flesh mixed with gunpowder and smoke, clinging to uniforms and hair, tanks smashed through barricades, their treads chewing through walls and rubble, sending showers of brick and plaster into the air. Each building taken was a battle won, but each victory was stained with loss. As the Americans moved closer to the heart of the city, the full extent of Japanese entrenchment became apparent. Snipers in the bell towers of Intramuros and San Agustin Cathedral turned the city's ancient skyline into a deadly crossfire zone. Hidden pillboxes fired into streets where no cover remained. The very canals that had once carried goods and people now became traps, lined with explosives and bodies. Even the Pasig River, wide and shimmering in times past, now reflected the orange glow of fire and the smoke of collapsed buildings, carrying debris and corpses downstream. Despite the hell that surrounded them, soldiers continued, driven by duty, memory, and the faint hope of saving civilians trapped in the chaos. Every step forward required a combination of brute force and cautious strategy, creeping along shattered walls, covering one another as they advanced, checking every doorway for concealed threats. The roar of artillery, the screech of shells, and the screams from hidden rooms became the city's rhythm, a terrible symphony of liberation. By the end of the month, American forces had reached the northern sectors of Intramuros, but even this progress came at a horrific cost. Casualty lists grew daily, street after street littered with the debris of war, buildings gutted and burned beyond recognition. The soldiers realized that Manila, far from being a simple liberation, had become an intricate maze of death, a city that would demand not just strength but endurance, patience, and the sacrifice of thousands more before its ancient heart could be claimed. In the eyes of the American troops, Manila was no longer just a city, it was a living battlefield. Every corner, every wall, every window concealed an enemy and a threat. Liberation had arrived, yes, but it was a liberation that came with fire, with blood, with screams echoing off the old stone facades that had once sung only of trade, faith, and life. The advance would continue, inch by inch, street by street, hour by hour. Manila itself was a trap, a labyrinth, and a nightmare, and every step forward carried the unspoken truth. Freedom had never been this costly. By mid-February 1945, the heart of Manila, the ancient walled city of Intramuros, had become a crucible of fire, smoke, and despair. Its centuries-old stone walls, which had once deflected the cannons of Spanish galleons and the ambitions of foreign empires, now shuddered under the relentless pounding of American artillery. From the riverbanks and elevated positions beyond the city, the roar of guns split the air in steady, punishing waves. Each shell sent plumes of dust and brick into the sky, and the familiar red-tiled roofs that had sheltered priests, students, and merchants for generations erupted in flames that turned the mornings into perpetual twilight. The streets, narrow and twisting, became death traps. Japanese defenders had fortified every corner, every archway, every colonial facade. They moved silently along walls, setting ambushes in courtyards, and firing from windows and bell towers. Machine guns erupted without warning. Grenades were hurled from shuttered balconies. In the shadow of the cathedral, where generations had sung hymns and celebrated weddings, the American soldiers encountered a furnace of gunfire and smoke. Every step forward was paid for with lives, every building a tomb as well as a prize. Civilians, the ones who had survived the first months of occupation and the mines that riddled the outer districts, sought refuge wherever they could. They crowded into churches, basements and convents, hoping that faith and stone could protect them. But faith proved fragile, and stone proved insufficient. The American shelling did not discriminate. St. Augustine, the Manila Cathedral, the University of Santo Tomas, shells struck indiscriminately, turning centuries of carved altars, frescoes and vaulted ceilings into rubble. The familiar smells of incense and aged wood were replaced with the acrid tang of smoke, charred flesh, and molten metal. As the bombardment intensified, the fires spread with frightening speed. Winds from the bay carried sparks across rooftops, igniting what remained of homes, shops, and small inns. The streets of Intramuros glowed orange against the grey sky, smoke twisting into spirals that masked the sun. Every alley became a corridor of fire and debris. Trapped civilians cried out, their voices carried and distorted by the walls that now acted as both cage and amplifier. Mothers clutched children, huddling beneath shattered arches, while the elderly crouched among overturned furniture and fallen beams. Japanese troops, far from surrendering, fought with a grim determination that made the city even more deadly. They had dug tunnels under convents, hidden themselves within church crypts, and rigged the streets with explosives. They fired from basements, sniping from rooftops, and used civilians as shields in some cases, exploiting the very humanity that the Americans sought to preserve. Their resistance was absolute, and each building taken by the Americans was paid for with countless lives, enemy, soldier, and civilian alike. The iconic stone walls, so often thought indestructible, began to crumble. Bastions that had withstood centuries of siege cracked under repeated artillery hits. Towers collapsed in clouds of brick dust, sending stone flying into streets already littered with bodies. The echoes of falling masonry mingled with the screams and the rattle of gunfire, creating a soundscape that was almost unbearable, a mechanical, human, and elemental symphony of destruction. By the third week of February, the city's interior was unrecognizable. Once grand plazas were mounds of twisted metal, bricks, and scorched timber. Churches which had stood for centuries as the spiritual centers of the city now existed as skeletal shells, walls blackened, stained glass shattered, and altars reduced to smoldering ash. The scent of fire lingered in every street, a persistent reminder that liberation had arrived, not as a gift, but as a punishment and cleansing by flame. Even as the Americans advanced block by block, the human cost was staggering. Civilians emerged from hiding, dazed and burned, some carrying the dead in their arms. Soldiers moved through the rubble cautiously, often forced to negotiate the bodies of friend and foe alike as they cleared the streets for the next push. Every building was a battlefield, every alley a killing zone, every step an encounter with the violent, chaotic imprint of war on urban life. The fire was indiscriminate, consuming both enemy and innocent alike. Once peaceful convents and schools became ash heaps. Markets that had sold fish, rice, and mangoes were now smoldering ruins. Even the hospitals, where the wounded and sick had sought refuge, were hit by shells and fire. Smoke filled every breathing space, molten metal and burning timbers rained down from upper floors. Relief was rare, even temporary. Death and suffering were constant companions. Yet amid the inferno, pockets of resistance and survival persisted. Small groups of civilians hid beneath collapsed walls or in basements where the flames had not yet reached. Some families fled through narrow alleys, navigating the maze of debris and barricades, guided only by instinct and the distant roar of artillery. Soldiers helped where they could, lifting rubble, carrying the wounded and marking paths through the wreckage. The courage of ordinary people, mothers, children, elders, and the very young, became a quiet counterpoint to the fury of the battle, a testament to endurance in the face of annihilation. By the end of February, Intramuros had been effectively reduced to rubble, its history, its architecture, and its people transformed into a burning monument of war. The Japanese resistance had been broken, but only at a cost that no one could fully tally. Streets were unrecognizable, buildings flattened or charred beyond repair, and the air thick with smoke, ash, and despair. What remained of the city was both liberated and desecrated, freedom delivered in the form of fire and blood. The walled city, which had once been the jewel of Manila, was now a furnace, molten, smouldering, and silent except for the groans of the injured, the crackling of fires, and the occasional rattle of distant gunfire. Liberation had arrived, but it had brought with it a devastation so absolute that it would haunt the city for decades to come. Intramuros was no longer a city of life, it had become a city of ashes. By the closing days of February 1945, Manila had ceased to resemble a city of life and had transformed into a vast tortured expanse of death. The streets that had once teemed with laughter, music, and commerce were now a grotesque theatre of carnage. Every avenue, plaza, and alley became a killing ground where the once familiar rhythms of urban life were replaced by the unrelenting cadence of artillery, gunfire, and human screams. The American advance had shattered the skeletal resistance of the Japanese, yet the soldiers' final acts of desperation ensured that no corner of the city would remain untouched by horror. Civilians who had endured 3 years of occupation were now trapped in a crucible that offered no refuge. Families huddled in basements, in convents, and under collapsed homes, hoping that stone, brick, or plaster could protect them from either side. But protection was an illusion. Shells rained down from artillery and aircraft, flattening buildings in sudden eruptions of brick and fire. Mines, hidden beneath streets and under debris, tore through men, women, and children alike. In many homes, civilians were buried alive under walls that collapsed from bombardments, their muffled cries swallowed by the smoke and dust of collapsing neighborhoods. Even as American soldiers pushed street by street, they encountered scenes that no training or experience could fully prepare them for. The once elegant fountains of Ermita were surrounded by charred bodies, the water long since evaporated by fire. Parks that had hosted picnics and promenades were now tangled with corpses and debris, twisted iron from playgrounds and benches sharp and dangerous beneath the rubble. Horses that had survived years of war now lay dead in the streets, their bodies bloated and stiffening, the remnants of cavalry and civilian pets mingled in death with the humans around them. Japanese soldiers, realizing the end was inevitable, became increasingly ruthless. In a grim calculus of terror, they executed civilians they suspected of aiding the Americans. Men, women, and children were dragged from homes and churches, lined along walls, and shot. Some were thrown into wells, others burned alive in the basements of schools or monasteries. The city's hospitals, intended as sanctuaries, were systematically violated. Doctors and nurses killed alongside the patients they had sworn to protect. No building, no matter how sacred, offered sanctuary. The Pasig River, which had once carried the city's commerce and life, now flowed black with oil, blood, and debris. Bridges were littered with the bodies of those attempting to flee, their cries drowned by the thunder of American artillery. Streets that had once been avenues of connection and commerce were now barriers of corpses and rubble, forcing soldiers to clear each block inch by inch while civilians tried desperately to escape the chaos. Children too young to comprehend strategy wandered amid the carnage, their eyes wide with confusion, some clutching the dead or dying hands of parents or siblings. The beauty that had defined Manila, its Spanish-era architecture, wide promenades, public squares and ornate churches, dissolved in smoke and fire. The University of Santo Tomas, a sanctuary of learning for centuries, became a labyrinth of charred hallways and collapsed floors, hiding civilians beneath its ruins. San Agustin, one of the oldest churches in the Philippines, was reduced to skeletal walls, its once pristine altar destroyed. Each landmark, each symbol of culture and history, became a marker of suffering, a testament to the brutality of urban warfare. Hunger and thirst compounded the misery. Those who had survived years of occupation now faced starvation amid the rubble, unable to forage safely in streets patrolled by Japanese snipers or under fire from American artillery. Many died, not from bullets but from exposure, exhaustion, or disease, their corpses mingling with those felled by more violent means. The familiar smells of Manila, salt from the bay, the fragrance of sampaguita, the aroma of street food, were replaced with the stench of decay, smoke, and burned flesh. The psychological impact on both soldiers and civilians was profound. American troops, trained for combat in jungles and islands, found themselves facing a battlefield where every building hid a threat, every street a death trap, and every moment carried the weight of human suffering. Civilians, forced to witness both their oppressors and liberators as agents of destruction, suffered trauma that would echo through generations. Even as the final Japanese units were cornered within Intramuros, sporadic massacres continued. Families hiding in attics or basements were discovered and executed. In some districts, small-scale uprisings by the trapped citizens were met with slaughter. The streets themselves became tombs, lined with bodies that would remain for days until American engineers and infantry cleared paths, exposing scenes that seemed almost biblical in their horror. By the end of the siege, it was estimated that over 100,000 civilians had perished, not merely collateral damage, but victims of deliberate massacres, starvation, and urban combat. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient for its vibrancy and beauty, was transformed into a charnel city. Its avenues, plazas, and parks, once centers of culture and life, now bore silent witness to the human cost of war, a landscape of death that would remain imprinted on memory long after the fires were extinguished. In the charnel streets of Manila, liberation arrived hand in hand with annihilation. Every block carried the echo of screams, every building a monument to suffering. The city, stripped of its soul and saturated with blood, became a stark reminder that freedom, when wrested through urban warfare, could burn as fiercely as it healed. As February bled into the latter days of 1945, the districts surrounding Manila Bay, once the bustling ports and promenades of commerce and leisure, were transformed into a theatre of incomprehensible horror. Malate, Ermita, and the lower reaches of Intramuros had long been gateways of life, their docks alive with fishermen, merchants, and travelers. Now they were gateways of death, echoing with the cries of the innocent, the clatter of gunfire, and the hollow rattle of collapsing buildings. Japanese forces, cornered and facing inevitable defeat, unleashed a wave of vengeance upon the civilians trapped in the bayfront neighborhoods. Admiral Iwabuchi's men, driven by fanaticism and despair, carried out systematic massacres, executing families in their homes, dragging women into alleys, and shooting children with cold precision. Priests were stripped of their robes, forced to kneel in the ruins of churches, and killed before their congregations. Even the hospitals, where wounded civilians and soldiers alike had sought refuge, were violated. Patients were slaughtered alongside nurses and orderlies in scenes of grotesque cruelty. The sounds of screams and gunfire echoed across the bay, mingling with the roar of American artillery from positions across the water. The streets were littered with the bodies of those who had no means of escape. Civilians attempting to flee toward the harbor were intercepted, shot on sight, or herded into warehouses and then set aflame. The once lively promenades and parks along Manila Bay became corridors of death, strewn with corpses that were too numerous to bury quickly. In some areas, Japanese soldiers forced groups of civilians into shallow trenches or buildings rigged with explosives, then fired upon them or set the structures alight, leaving no survivor. The water of Manila Bay itself became tainted. The tide carried floating bodies, debris, and the scent of blood and salt. Ships and small boats bobbed silently among corpses, once used harbors now serving as unnatural graves. The psychological terror imposed by these massacres was compounded by the speed and brutality with which they were executed. Families that had huddled together for days, seeking protection in church basements or warehouses, were torn apart in minutes. Mothers clutched infants as they were dragged away. Children were left behind, too small or too frightened to run. Entire neighborhoods were emptied in hours, leaving behind a silence so profound that the occasional footfall or distant gunshot seemed amplified, a reminder of the perverse vigilance of death. American forces, advancing steadily from the southern districts, encountered the aftermath of these atrocities at every turn. Soldiers were confronted with floating bodies along the riverbanks, charred corpses in burned-out houses, and survivors so traumatized they could barely speak. The engineers and medics who moved behind the infantry worked tirelessly to remove the dead and care for the living, but the scale of destruction was almost unmanageable. Streets that had been the arteries of life now resembled rivers of ash and decay. The smell of smoke, blood, and rot became inescapable, searing itself into the memories of all who passed through. Even as the massacres continued, the Americans pressed forward. Artillery and infantry assaults systematically dismantled Japanese strongpoints along the Bay districts, but with every building cleared, more bodies were uncovered. Civilians who had survived the initial shelling now emerged only to witness the last acts of vengeance by a defeated but still lethal enemy. The bayfront streets became symbolic of the duality of Manila's liberation. The city was being freed from occupation, but the cost was measured in the most absolute human terms. Some Japanese units, isolated and desperate, took extreme measures to leave no witness. Small groups of men rounded up civilians, dragging them into warehouses or down to the shoreline, and executed them in silence or through brutal improvisation. Churches, long refuges of sanctuary, were desecrated and burned with people still inside. The familiar skyline of domes, spires, and arches became a silhouette against the smoke and fire, a dark stage on which the final acts of human cruelty played out. Even the bay itself, usually a site of life and commerce, was transformed. Small fishing boats, mangled and overturned, drifted among floating corpses. The tide carried bodies toward the open sea, where they clashed with the mangled remains of ships and debris. The water, once sparkling with sunlight reflecting off the bay, now ran red in the shadows of sunken piers and shells. The natural rhythm of the sea was replaced with the evidence of human violence, floating silence, punctuated by the occasional cry of a survivor struggling to reach safety. These massacres were not random acts, they were acts of calculation and revenge, carried out by soldiers who understood that their time was running out. Every day of resistance became more violent, and every hour closer to defeat prompted more ruthless attempts to punish those they had once occupied. The city, which had once been alive with trade and culture, now existed as a landscape of horror, where streets were lined with corpses, homes were hollowed tombs, and the water itself bore witness to unspeakable crimes. The survivors of the Bay districts, if they were able to escape, carried memories that would last a lifetime. Mothers who had seen children shot, priests who had been forced to witness the execution of parishioners, and entire families torn apart by indiscriminate violence, all bore scars that were invisible yet permanent. Even after the American forces secured the bayfront and the Japanese units were finally neutralized, the city remained haunted by the magnitude of its suffering. By the end of these final days at Manila Bay, the shoreline and the streets leading from it had become something between land and graveyard, a place where history and atrocity intersected in a manner almost impossible to comprehend. The beauty of the harbor, its promise of trade, leisure, and connection to the wider world, was drowned beneath the water and ashes of mass slaughter. The city's liberation was real, but it arrived hand in hand with a horror that could not be erased. In the Bay districts, the water ran red, the streets were littered with the dead, the city's harbors had become pools of silence, floating death, and the echoes of a humanity that had endured too much before freedom could finally, painfully arrive. As February 1945 deepened, the southern districts of Manila, Ermita, Malate, and the neighborhoods surrounding the bay were engulfed in fire, smoke, and an almost unimaginable human cruelty. The Japanese naval units, led by the fanaticism of Admiral Iwabuchi and his officers, continued to defy Yamashita's orders to evacuate the city. Instead of surrender or retreat, they committed acts that would etch the word atrocity permanently into the memory of Manila. Schools, hospitals, convents, spaces once devoted to learning, healing, and sanctuary, were converted into instruments of terror. Their walls witnessed to acts so depraved that the survivors would carry them as lifelong scars. In the schools, classrooms that had once been bright with sunlight and filled with chalk-dusted children were repurposed as prisons. Teachers, students, and local families seeking shelter were dragged into darkened hallways and storage rooms. Floors were stained with blood, desks and chairs smashed to make room for the tortures inflicted within. Some children, barely older than 10, were witnesses to the slaughter of family members or forced to endure brutality themselves. In the twisted calculus of the occupiers, innocence became a weapon. The more helpless, the more terrorizing their victims. Hospitals, the supposed sanctuaries of care and compassion, became the scenes of unspeakable horror. Patients, many already weak from starvation, illness, or injury, were slaughtered in hallways and wards. Nurses and doctors were executed for refusing to cooperate or even for attempting to protect the wounded. Operating rooms, once places of life and recovery, were converted into sites of mutilation. The stench of burning flesh, mingled with antiseptic chemicals and the metallic tang of blood, hung in the air like a curse. Windows shattered from gunfire and artillery, and the cries of victims carried down the streets, mixing with the distant roar of tanks and shelling. Convents, previously sanctuaries of prayer, discipline, and charity, were not spared. Sisters who had devoted their lives to caring for orphans and the sick were violated, murdered, or forced to witness the death of those under their protection. Sacred spaces, chapels, cloisters, and refectories became traps with makeshift barricades rigged for defense or destruction. Precious religious artifacts, crucifixes, icons, chalices, were smashed or used as blunt instruments. In these acts, the very faith of the city was under siege, stripped down to fear, despair, and survival. The human toll was uncountable. Women were abducted from their homes or from hiding in basements, subjected to systematic rape before being executed or left to die. Children watched helplessly as parents, siblings, and neighbors were torn from their lives. Many survivors described the horror in fragmented whispers: mothers hiding infants in trash bins, priests forced to bury bodies while bullets flew through windows, families discovering loved ones mutilated or burned in their own homes. The psychological terror was as great as the physical violence. Entire communities were traumatized, their sense of safety obliterated in a single day. The brutality was not random, it was organized, deliberate, and fanatical. Japanese troops seemed to operate under a perverse logic. Destruction and humiliation would mark every inch of territory before the Americans could claim it. Streets, homes, and public buildings were rigged for violence. Civilians who attempted to flee were captured, killed, or used as human shields against the advancing Americans. Survivors recalled that in some cases, soldiers forced families to dig graves and then executed them, leaving the shallow pits filled with the bodies of multiple victims. Amid the chaos, Manila itself seemed to scream. The cries of women, children, and the elderly echoed through bombed-out streets and empty plazas. The ancient architecture, Spanish colonial homes, churches, schools, became a stage for acts that seemed to mock the very endurance and faith of the city. The once vibrant murals, polished floors, and carved altars were desecrated. Fires broke out frequently, consuming buildings and turning familiar neighborhoods into walls of molten heat and smoke. The city became not just a battlefield, but a crucible of terror, a laboratory of human cruelty where survival was measured in minutes, not days. Even American forces, as they closed in on the southern districts, were confronted with the scale of these atrocities. They found hospitals burned to the ground, convents stripped of sanctity, and schools turned into prisons and slaughterhouses. Survivors told stories in fragments, tales of unimaginable suffering and cruelty, of neighborhoods emptied of life in a single night, of children and women violated and murdered. Soldiers documented what they could, but much of the horror was ineffable, a darkness too vast for words. In these weeks, the very concept of sanctuary was shattered. Manila's people were caught between the shelling and the tanks of the liberators and the merciless vengeance of a desperate occupier. Innocence was no protection. Schools, hospitals, and convents which had once embodied hope became prisons, traps, and execution grounds. The city itself seemed to mourn, its streets, alleys, and courtyards heavy with smoke, flame, and the unrelenting weight of grief. By the end of February, the rape of the innocent, a phrase too small to encompass what had occurred, had carved itself into the soul of Manila. Survivors emerged from basements, ruins, and improvised shelters bearing the scars of unimaginable trauma. Families were decimated, communities destroyed, and faith tested beyond comprehension. Liberation was near, but the human cost of the Japanese naval unit's fanaticism was already etched in stone, ash, and memory. The city, already a furnace of fire and blood, now carried another burden, the knowledge that some of its suffering was inflicted not in the chaos of combat, but in deliberate, cold-blooded acts of cruelty that would haunt survivors and descendants for generations. By late February 1945, the liberation of Manila had reached a terrifying crescendo. 6th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, was determined to root out every last pocket of Japanese resistance, and the methods employed reflected both necessity and the grim calculus of urban warfare. Artillery fire rained down with mechanical precision, tearing through buildings, roads, and plazas. The city, already weakened by months of occupation, Japanese fortification, and prior shelling, began to crumble under the relentless onslaught. Tanks and armored vehicles advanced slowly, their engines growling, their guns cutting wide swaths through streets that had once been alive with commerce and culture. Soldiers moved behind them, clearing each building systematically. Every wall torn away revealed either Japanese defenders, sometimes fighting to the last bullet, or the horrifying remains of civilians who had been trapped, executed, or buried beneath rubble. Fire followed wherever soldiers advanced, either from artillery-induced ignition or from the scorched earth tactics necessary to flush out entrenched enemies. The scent of smoke, gunpowder, and burning flesh became omnipresent, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of molten wood and stone. Entire districts, Ermita, Malat, Santa Cruz, Tondo, were reduced to skeletal remains. Elegant colonial houses were stripped to their bare frameworks, their walls collapsed into rubble. Cobblestone streets buckled under shell impacts, leaving trenches and craters that further complicated the advance. Churches, which had survived centuries of natural disasters, Spanish sieges, and colonial skirmishes, were now gutted by American shells. The once pristine interiors were charred, windows blown out, and altars reduced to ash. Even streets lined with rows of market stalls and homes became indistinguishable from a war zone, a continuous landscape of ruin punctuated by fire and the occasional wail of those who had survived the initial bombardments. The psychological weight on both civilians and soldiers was immense. Americans, hardened by months of combat in the jungles of New Guinea and Leyte, now faced an enemy that had turned the city itself into a weapon. Every street, every alley, every building was a potential death trap. Sniper fire from ruined upper stories cut down the unwary. Mines hidden beneath debris or buried under streets claimed soldiers and civilians alike. Engineers worked feverishly to clear paths, yet the very act of moving through the city became a trial of courage and endurance. For the trapped civilians, liberation had arrived as a double-edged sword. The roar of artillery promised freedom from Japanese tyranny, yet every shell that fell carried destruction alongside salvation. Families huddled in basements and cellars, praying that the next explosion would not reach them. Women and children fled through streets already filled with rubble, sometimes to be met with the final acts of Japanese vengeance, executions, arson, or forced conscription into the chaos. Hospitals, schools, and convents continued to burn, their fires now fed both by earlier Japanese arson and American artillery strikes intended to eliminate remaining resistance. The intensity of the bombardment blurred the line between liberation and annihilation. Streets once lined with merchants and vendors became corridors of fire and rubble. Bridges were torn apart to deny Japanese movement, canals choked with debris, and even open squares became improvised killing zones as tanks rumbled across them. The very architecture of Manila, the domes, arches, and tiled roofs, became a chaotic theatre for both the destruction of the enemy and the preservation of life in the form of cautious infantry advances. The collapse of structures often led to further loss of civilian life. Houses, many already weakened by prior shelling, crumbled under the weight of artillery, burying families beneath walls and roofs. The fire consumed what the shells did not destroy, leaving neighborhoods as smoldering skeletons. The streets were alive with the echoes of battle, the mechanical staccato of machine guns, the deep reverberation of tanks firing, the crackle of flames, and the distant roar of falling buildings. Amid this, the American soldiers continued their methodical advance. Clearing each block, each building, each intersection, they fought through sniper fire, hidden machine guns, and booby traps. For every Japanese soldier neutralized, civilians emerged from hiding, dazed, burned, hungry, and traumatized. In some instances, soldiers were forced to carry survivors through the rubble to safety, witnessing firsthand the unimaginable suffering inflicted by both the occupiers and the city's destruction itself. The intensity of the battle escalated as Americans approached Intramuros, the walled heart of Manila. Here, resistance was most concentrated, and artillery was employed with devastating effect. Barricades were obliterated, sniper positions leveled, and fortified buildings reduced to rubble. The fires ignited by shelling, combined with those set by retreating Japanese troops, creating a landscape that was as much inferno as battlefield. Every shot fired, every building destroyed, advanced the cause of liberation, yet carried with it the undeniable weight of death. In essence, by the end of February, Manila had become both the instrument and the victim of its own liberation. The city's beauty, its fountains, plazas, colonial facades, and narrow streets had been flattened, transformed into a jagged, smoking terrain that bore the marks of human cruelty and military necessity alike. Freedom had arrived, but it burned brighter than death itself, a light that illuminated the ruins, corpses, and anguish left behind. The liberation of Manila was total, yet the cost measured in rubble, blood, and trauma would endure far longer than the battles themselves. The city was free, yet in its freedom lay an indelible scar. Liberation had become indistinguishable from destruction, and Manila's very soul had been forged anew in fire. As the final days of February 1945 unfolded, the ancient Spanish heart of Manila, Intramuros, teetered on the brink of annihilation. For centuries, the walled city had stood as the symbol of Manila's endurance, a repository of history, faith, and colonial architecture. Its narrow cobblestone streets had seen the passage of Spanish galleons, American administrators, and generations of Filipino citizens. But now, Intramuros had become a fortress of despair, bristling with Japanese defenders determined to resist until the last man. The city, once a jewel of culture and heritage, faced destruction unlike any in its long history. By this point, American forces had methodically cleared the surrounding districts, their tanks and infantry pushing closer to the walled city. Artillery fire shook the centuries-old walls, sending showers of brick and mortar into the streets below. Japanese snipers, hidden in bell towers and hollowed buildings, picked off advancing soldiers, but even their fanatical resistance could not hold against the overwhelming weight of the US Sixth Army. Engineers worked tirelessly to defuse mines and clear barricades, inching the soldiers closer to the final confrontation within Intramuros. The battle within the walled city was house by house, block by block. Narrow alleys became death traps, where every doorway could conceal a hidden machine gun or a rigged explosive. Civilians trapped within the walls, huddled in basements, churches, and convents, their prayers mingling with the groans of the wounded and the rattle of gunfire. Many buildings, once centers of learning, faith, and administration, became tombs. The University of Santo Tomas, the San Agustin Church, and other historic sites were subjected to bombardment and fire, their centuries-old facades reduced to rubble while their interiors were gutted. Every explosion echoed through the walls, a thunderous obliteration of history itself. The defenders, desperate and cornered, fought to the last man. Streets ran with the blood of both soldiers and civilians, and the air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid stench of burning wood and flesh. The city's archives, where generations of records, manuscripts, and documents chronicling the life of Manila and its people had been kept, were consumed in the flames. Letters, legal records, religious texts, and administrative files, some dating back to the earliest days of Spanish rule, vanished in hours, lost to fire and gunfire. Historians and citizens would later mourn not just the lives lost, but the irreplaceable cultural memory that had been destroyed. Churches, the spiritual heart of Intramuros, fared no better. St. Augustine, the Manila Cathedral, and other sacred spaces, once adorned with centuries of carvings, frescoes, and gold leaf altars, were gutted in the relentless fire. Roofs collapsed under bombardment, walls cracked and fell, and bells that had rung for weddings, funerals, and masses for generations lay shattered and silent. Convents that had housed nuns and orphans were leveled, their corridors echoing with the cries of the last survivors as American soldiers fought to clear the final pockets of resistance. Even the walls of Intramuros, which had withstood centuries of siege and natural disasters, could not survive the modern firepower brought against them. Artillery shells and tank fire shattered gates and bastions, sending masonry tumbling into streets already littered with corpses and debris. The strategic use of demolitions by retreating Japanese units compounded the destruction, bringing down structures deliberately to delay the advance and to maximize casualties. What had once been the impenetrable heart of Manila was now a skeletal ruin, a city within a city reduced to ash and rubble. The fall of Intramuros was both a tactical and symbolic moment. Militarily, the elimination of the last Japanese strongholds marked the near completion of Manila's liberation. Symbolically, it was the obliteration of Manila's historical and cultural identity. Centuries of Spanish and Filipino heritage were erased in mere days. Streets that had once echoed with the voices of scholars, priests, merchants, and citizens were now silent, but for the crackling of fires and the occasional distant gunshot. The city's soul, its memory, and its history had been scorched along with its buildings. Civilians who survived the destruction emerged into a landscape unrecognizable. The familiar contours of plazas, squares, and streets had vanished, replaced by heaps of brick, timber, and twisted metal. The psychological toll was staggering. Survivors confronted not only the loss of life, but the obliteration of the cultural markers that had anchored their identity. Religious relics, historic monuments, libraries, and municipal archives were gone, leaving a void that could never be restored. As the last pockets of Japanese resistance were neutralized, the flames consuming Intramuros illuminated the night sky, a molten reminder of both the cost of war and the price of liberation. Soldiers, civilians, and the few remaining nuns or elders watched as centuries of history crumbled into ash, understanding that victory in Manila had come not through preservation, but through destruction. Liberation and annihilation had become inseparable. Intramuros, the crown jewel of Manila, had fallen. Its walls were breached, its defenders eliminated, its churches and archives destroyed. What remained was a charred skeleton of history, a city that had been liberated at the cost of its own memory. The collapse of the walled city was complete, and Manila itself would never be the same again. By March 1945, the aftermath of Manila's siege had transformed the city into a landscape of ruin, so absolute that even the river, once a source of life and commerce, seemed to mourn its own city. The Pasig River, which had long carried sampans, barges, and ferries under the warm tropical sun, now flowed black and viscous, a thick ribbon of water bearing the remnants of destruction. Oil, debris, and the bodies of the dead floated along its surface, moving silently downstream as if the river itself were attempting to carry away the weight of the city's suffering. Twisted remnants of bridges hung precariously over the dark water, their steel beams warped by fire and artillery, their foundations undermined by explosives. The air along the riverbanks was heavy and oppressive. Smoke rose in dense choking columns from the remnants of the southern districts and the ruins of Intramuros, carrying with it the acrid scent of charred wood, stone and the unmistakable tang of burning flesh. Each gust of wind seemed to swirl ash and soot into every corner, coating the streets, the river, and the faces of survivors in a grey patina that made breathing laborious and vision uncertain. Even sunlight, filtering weakly through the haze, seemed dulled and unnatural, a dim, sickly light over a city that had been starved of its vibrancy and vitality. Walking along the banks, one could see the skeletal remains of what had once been homes, markets, and warehouses. The wooden stilts of houses that had lined the water's edge had burned away, leaving only blackened posts jutting from the water like the fingers of the dead. Ships that had once carried goods to and from the port were half sunken or overturned, their hulls scarred by shell fire. The water itself seemed to reflect the city's suffering, oily, dark and motionless in many stretches, broken only by floating corpses, drifting debris, or the occasional ripple of something alive struggling to survive. The destruction along the Pasig extended to the bridges, which had once connected districts and facilitated the flow of daily life. Their arches, now warped or collapsed, created jagged skeletons over the river. Some spans had been destroyed deliberately by retreating Japanese troops to slow the American advance, leaving gaps that made crossing treacherous and forced survivors to wade through water thick with debris and corpses. Steel and masonry twisted in unnatural angles, a violent geometric reminder of how human engineering, civilization itself, could be obliterated in hours. The riverbanks, which had once hosted vendors selling fish, rice, and tropical fruits, were now littered with the remnants of human life and domestic labor. Burned carts, twisted bicycles, charred crates, and fragments of furniture mingled with the bodies of the dead. Occasionally, a surviving civilian would emerge, carrying a child or dragging the unconscious, their eyes hollow, faces streaked with ash and tears. The air was punctuated by the low moan of the wounded, the distant crackle of fires that still burned in pockets, and the constant grinding echo of military vehicles as they continued to move through streets now unrecognizable. Even the wildlife of the river suffered. Fish and waterfowl, displaced by the blackened waters and choking smoke, had disappeared from the river. The once constant chorus of birds and insects along the riverbanks was replaced by silence, broken only by the unnatural sounds of war and its aftermath, distant gunfire, the groans of survivors, and the collapse of ruined structures. The natural rhythm of the city, which had long been tied to the life of the Pasig, was shattered completely. The psychological toll on survivors and soldiers alike was immense. Civilians who had escaped the immediate carnage of the siege were confronted with the full scope of the destruction, neighborhoods obliterated, familiar landmarks gone, and a river that should have been life-giving now a grim symbol of death and desolation. Soldiers moving along the river's edge to secure districts or clear mines were forced to step over the remains of families, wade through debris-laden water, and endure the smell and sight of death in ways that would haunt them long after the fighting ended. Amid this devastation, Manila's identity as the Pearl of the Orient was all but erased. The vibrant streets, colonial architecture, bustling markets, and cultural landmarks that had once defined the city had vanished. In their place lay ash, smoke, and a pervasive silence broken only by the occasional cry, the groan of a burning building collapsing, or the slow ripple of the river carrying yet more debris downstream. The light of the city, its culture, and its history seemed extinguished, replaced by the dull grey glow of ruin and the thick, black smoke that rose like a shroud over the water. The Pasig River, once a lifeline, had become a river of smoke and death, a moving testament to the price of war, urban combat, and fanatic resistance. It mirrored the city itself, scarred, bleeding, and barely recognizable. Manila was alive only in fragments, survivors moving cautiously through ruined streets, soldiers pressing forward, and the occasional stubborn structure that still stood amid the rubble. But the overall impression was clear. The pearl had been shattered, and its heart now flowed black beneath the ash-laden skies. In the river of smoke, liberation and destruction were inseparable. Freedom had arrived, but it carried with it the weight of devastation. The water, the bridges, the streets, and the riverbanks all became memorials to a city that had burned, drowned, and suffered in a manner few could imagine. Manila's light had been snuffed out, leaving only smoke, ash, and the murky, black waters of the Pasig to tell the story. When the final echoes of artillery faded and the roar of tanks receded into memory, Manila lay in silence, a city liberated yet unrecognizable. The Americans who had advanced through block after block of resistance now walked cautiously through what they had fought to reclaim. The streets, once alive with commerce, chatter, and color, were empty corridors of ruin, lined with the skeletal remains of homes, churches, and civic buildings. Half of the city's population was dead or missing, casualties of bombardment, massacre, and famine. The survivors emerged from basements, churches, and hidden shelters, their faces blank and haunted, their bodies thin and smeared with ash, mud, and soot. The scale of devastation was overwhelming. Streets were choked with rubble, vehicles twisted beyond recognition, and the air was thick with the acrid smoke of burned timber and masonry. Personal belongings, charred clothing, fragments of furniture, scorched photographs lay scattered among the ruins, silent witnesses to lives interrupted. Markets, parks, and plazas were nothing more than flattened ground, marked only by the shadows of what had once stood there. Even familiar landmarks, like the walled gates of Intramuros or the grand churches, existed only as gutted shells, their roofs collapsed, walls shattered, and interiors blackened with soot. Civilians wandered through this landscape like ghosts, disoriented and numb. Mothers clutched children, the youngest too small to comprehend the scale of loss, while elderly citizens moved slowly over debris, leaning on sticks or the arms of neighbors. Streets that had once carried traffic, bicycles, and carts now carried only silence and the occasional distant groan of the injured or the moan of a trapped animal. Survivors called out for missing relatives, but often their cries met only the emptiness of the city, swallowed by ash-laden wind and the echoes of buildings collapsing in distant pockets. The psychological toll on the liberated was immense. Those who had endured the occupation, the massacres, and the bombardments now faced the incomprehensible task of grappling with the scale of loss. Children who had hidden beneath floors or behind walls for weeks now emerged to find streets lined with corpses. Families who had huddled together during the final Japanese onslaught found themselves alone, their homes destroyed, neighbors dead, and the social fabric of the city shredded beyond recognition. Every step through the rubble was a reminder of survival in a place where life and death had collided so violently that the boundaries between them had become nearly meaningless. American soldiers, too, were confronted by a city that no longer bore resemblance to the Manila they had known in brief reconnaissance visits or maps. Buildings reduced to ashes, bridges twisted over the blackened Pasig, and the pervasive stench of decay created a scene both alien and horrifying. The liberation they had fought for came with a profound cost, and the faces of the survivors served as living testaments to the human toll. Soldiers guided civilians to makeshift relief points, but even as they offered water, blankets, or medical care, the scale of trauma seemed almost impossible to mitigate. The city's infrastructure, water, electricity, communication, was decimated. Streets were impassable in many areas, blocked by rubble, fire-ravaged vehicles, and unexploded ordnance. Hospitals, schools, and administrative buildings had been destroyed or severely damaged, leaving survivors without the very institutions that could begin the process of recovery. Civic life, the routines of work, worship, and social interaction, had been suspended indefinitely, leaving the population suspended in a liminal space between survival and mourning. Amid the ruins, the Pasig River reflected the grey skies, carrying debris, ash, and the occasional drifting body. Its waters, black and heavy, were a constant reminder of the human cost of liberation. The bridges spanning it, once vital arteries of commerce and connection, were twisted and impassable. The river banks, where children once played and merchants once hawked their goods, now served as temporary resting places for the dead and a treacherous pathway for the living. The silence was deafening. Gone were the market's chatter, the bells of churches, and the laughter of children. In their place were groans, sobs, the creak of collapsing timber, and the faint murmur of survivors calling for those they had lost. Manila, once a vibrant jewel, had been transformed into a city of ruins, where the memory of life hung over the streets like a ghost. The Liberation's lament, as it would later be called, was not a victory sung in celebration, but a solemn procession through ash, blood, and ruin. Freedom had been achieved, but the cost was measured not in land or territory, but in the obliteration of lives, neighborhoods, and centuries of cultural memory. The survivors, walking through the wreckage, carried in their eyes the weight of trauma and the understanding that liberation, when bought with fire and blood, could leave a city alive only in fragments. Manila had survived, yet it was unrecognizable. The pearl of the Orient, once radiant and bustling, was now a city of shadows and ash, a city whose streets, bridges, and buildings bore witness to a liberation that had arrived at the cost of the very life it sought to save. With Manila's streets slowly quieting, and the roar of artillery reduced to distant echoes, the human and moral cost of the siege came sharply into focus. The city had been liberated, yet the devastation was staggering. Half of its population dead or missing, entire districts flattened, and centuries of architecture, culture, and memory reduced to rubble. Amid this landscape of ash and sorrow, the decisions of commanders on both sides became a matter of scrutiny, reflection, and for some, personal reckoning. Admiral Iwabuchi Sanji, the Japanese officer who had defied orders to withdraw and had entrenched his forces in the walled city, chose the ancient ritual of seppuku in the aftermath of the city's fall. His suicide, carried out with a ceremonial sword in a ruined building that had once been a government office, was both a personal act of honor and an acknowledgement of ultimate failure. To the Japanese, it was a final, if hollow, redemption, a way to reclaim agency after orchestrating the suffering of tens of thousands. Yet for the city and its people, the act was meaningless. His fanaticism had left a landscape of horror, and his death could not bring back the dead, rebuild the libraries and churches, or soothe the trauma of the survivors. Across the battlefield, American commanders faced a different kind of reckoning. General Douglas MacArthur, having returned to the Philippines as a symbol of liberation, toured the ruined capital amid flurries of press coverage and political optics. He walked streets choked with rubble, stepping over remnants of homes and marketplaces, observing survivors emerging cautiously from hidden shelters. Official reports filed by the U.S. Sixth Army meticulously catalogued the destruction, justifying artillery fire as necessary to dislodge entrenched Japanese forces. Tactical language, neutral, clinical, precise, veiled the human cost in bureaucratic phrasing. Buildings flattened, civilians caught in crossfire, neighborhoods erased. Every objective achieved in those reports carried the shadow of thousands of lives extinguished in the fire and smoke of liberation. Yet even in the careful prose of military reports, the weight of guilt and moral ambiguity lingered. Officers understood that urban warfare against a fanatical opponent had necessitated heavy bombardment, but no technical justification could erase the sight of women, children, and the elderly lying among the ruins. The city's destruction, its architecture, archives, schools, and hospitals bore witness to the impossibility of a clean victory. The Americans had won strategically, yet morally, Manila offered no triumph. Every liberated block had been purchased with the fire that consumed both enemy and innocent alike. MacArthur's public statements, delivered against the backdrop of the smoking skyline, emphasized victory, liberation, and the return of freedom to the Filipino people. Yet behind the ceremonial photos and triumphant rhetoric, the city whispered its own story of guilt, of unavoidable brutality, of liberation inseparable from annihilation. Civilians, too traumatized to celebrate, wandered amidst the ruins with blank faces, their survival a testament to resilience rather than triumph. For them, the return of a commander was less a herald of freedom than a reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, investigations and post-battle analyses documented the scope of Japanese atrocities and the consequences of American tactics. The official US stance framed the destruction as unfortunate but unavoidable, while Japanese records, fragmented and partially destroyed, acknowledged that Iwabuchi's refusal to evacuate Intramuros had magnified the scale of suffering exponentially. Both sides were complicit in the city's devastation, one in its defense with vengeance, the other in its liberation with overwhelming force. The moral ledger of Manila remained unsettled, an eternal tension between necessity and tragedy. Even years later, the ruins themselves served as testimony to these judgments. The collapsed walls, blackened streets, and charred remains of cultural landmarks stood as silent witnesses to the choices of commanders and the human consequences of those decisions. Manila's destruction was not merely a byproduct of war, it was the outcome of human intent, fanaticism, strategy, and command. The city's silence was both an accusation and a chronicle, recording the consequences of leadership that measured success in tactical objectives while millions paid the ultimate price. In the end, Manila's streets whispered the reckoning of all who had held power over them. Iwabuchi's seppuku represented personal honor stained by mass murder. American generals' reports represented administrative justification for ruin, and MacArthur's visit, triumphant yet shadowed by guilt, symbolized a victory that could not erase memory, suffering, or loss. The liberated city stood amid smoke and ash as a witness to command, accountability, and the impossible moral calculus of urban war. Manila's liberation had been declared, yet its conscience remained unquiet, a city rebuilt on ruins, haunted by both its oppressors and its liberators, where victory and guilt flowed side by side in the blackened streets and river of smoke. In the weeks following the cessation of combat, the survivors of Manila faced a grim and overwhelming task: to reckon with the scale of human loss that lay strewn across the city. The streets, plazas, and riverbanks were littered with bodies, many decomposing in the tropical heat, many still trapped beneath rubble and charred timber. American and Filipino forces, along with makeshift civilian recovery teams, worked to gather the dead with methodical care, cataloguing them where possible, separating those whose identities could be discerned from the uncountable masses who remained anonymous. Yet the process was painfully inadequate. Families returned to neighborhoods that no longer existed, hoping to locate loved ones, only to discover homes reduced to ash, streets unrecognizable, and names that could not be retrieved. The very act of mourning became a labyrinth of frustration, uncertainty, and grief, as countless victims vanished into unmarked mass graves, their memory preserved only in the fragmentary whispers of survivors. The collection of bodies itself became a ritual of silent horror. Soldiers and volunteers moved through the ruins with shovels, stretchers, and wagons, lifting corpses from collapsed buildings, charred homes, and bombed-out streets. Each corpse told a story: a mother clutching a child, siblings holding hands in death, priests kneeling as if in eternal prayer, children frozen mid-step in the midst of flight. In the tropical heat, decomposition was rapid, and the smell of death pervaded every quarter of the city. Temporary burial sites were established along open fields and cleared plazas, marked with crude wooden crosses or numbered markers. Many graves were hasty, shallow, and incomplete, an attempt to bring order to the chaos of mass mortality, rather than to provide the dignity of remembrance. Despite the scale of human tragedy, the machinery of governance moved quickly toward rebuilding. Both the US and Filipino authorities focused on restoring Manila's functionality as a capital, a port, and a commercial hub. Roads were cleared, bridges repaired, and infrastructure reconstructed, often atop mass graves or areas still littered with remnants of the siege. The narrative of liberation, national recovery, and triumph in the Pacific War overshadowed the specific horrors that civilians had endured. The individual stories of loss, the massacres along the bay, the rape of the innocent in schools and hospitals, and the destruction of Intramuros became footnotes to a larger story of military victory. Manila's dead, once numerous enough to fill entire districts, began to fade from the public consciousness, their presence acknowledged in statistics but rarely in memorials or commemorations. Families, too, faced the cruel paradox of survival. They were expected to rebuild while mourning in private, forced to navigate bureaucratic obstacles to recover property, identify missing relatives, and secure relief. Orphaned children, widows and displaced elders wandered through the ruins searching for remnants of their past lives. The city's cemeteries, overwhelmed by the sheer number of corpses, offered only partial solace. Mass graves, some hastily covered in sand and lime, became the final resting place for thousands whose names would never be recorded. The trauma of the survivors was compounded by the erasure of physical markers. Neighborhoods once vibrant with culture, commerce and family life were replaced by rubble and ash, leaving emotional voids that could never be filled. The international community, focused on the broader arc of World War II and the surrender of Japan, largely overlooked Manila's suffering. Headlines celebrated victory, liberation, and the end of Japanese expansion, but the magnitude of civilian slaughter and urban destruction was barely reported outside local channels. The forgotten dead became just that, forgotten by global history, diminished in memory to statistics and passing references. Survivors' testimonies, while recorded in government or military archives, were rarely amplified to the level of public consciousness, their voices subsumed in the narratives of strategy, heroism, and progress. The city itself bore witness to this slow erasure. Streets once lined with debris became cleared and rebuilt, bridges reconstructed, and public spaces redesigned to serve commerce and administration. Yet the soil of Manila retained its memory. Beneath new foundations, along the banks of the Pasig, and beneath plazas now paved over, rested the countless civilians who had perished, the mothers, children, priests and laborers whose lives had been extinguished. The blackened river, the scorched districts, and the charred remains of buildings stood as mute testimony, yet even these visible scars would gradually fade under the pressures of reconstruction and urban renewal. This selective forgetting was not malevolent, but pragmatic. Governments, military authorities, and urban planners prioritized rebuilding over remembrance, believing that the city's recovery required focus on the future rather than mourning the past. Yet in doing so, the collective trauma of the Manila Massacre, its human cost, and the intricate horrors of urban warfare were marginalized. Even as survivors walked the streets of the reconstructed city, memory was private, embedded in personal grief, photographs and oral history, fragments of testimony resisting the slow erasure imposed by necessity, politics and time. By the end of 1945, Manila had begun to physically recover, yet the memory of its dead remained precarious. Families who had lost everything wandered the streets of the restored city, searching for names that would never be found. The dead lay beneath the foundations of new buildings, along the banks of the Pasig, and in unmarked mass graves, their stories silenced by reconstruction, bureaucracy, and the passage of time. Globally, the massacre faded from view, eclipsed by broader narratives of the war's conclusion and post-war geopolitics. Manila, the Pearl of the Orient, survived in structure, but remained a city haunted by absence, where the voices of the forgotten dead whispered beneath the bustle of reconstruction and the emerging rhythms of a recovering capital. In this way, the forgotten dead were not entirely erased. They lived on in memory, in rubble, and in the silent testimony of survivors, waiting for recognition that history often denied. In the years following the liberation of Manila, the city began to rise once more, though its revival was layered with absence and memory. The rubble of destroyed streets was cleared, mangled vehicles removed, and the skeletons of buildings were gradually replaced by concrete and steel. Modernity arrived quickly, in the form of glass towers, reinforced roads, and standardized city blocks designed to serve the administrative and commercial needs of a recovering capital. The echoes of colonial architecture were largely supplanted by a utilitarian urban landscape, where Baroque facades had once reflected tropical sunlight. Now plain concrete walls and reflective glass surfaces marked the skyline. Sidewalks, highways and riverfronts were reconstructed to facilitate commerce, transportation and governance, offering the impression of normalcy while hiding the scars beneath. Yet beneath this new surface lay the city's unspoken history. Mass graves, hastily prepared during the immediate aftermath of the siege, remained beneath streets, parks, and open lots. Burned-out homes and foundations had never been fully excavated, leaving fragments of human remains beneath the foundations of new buildings. Even as schools, hospitals, and marketplaces were rebuilt, the soil beneath Manila's renewed streets contained the residue of horror, bone dust, charred fragments of clothing, and the faint trace of lives extinguished in a conflagration that had claimed half the population. The city's renewal was both physical and symbolic, but the reconstruction could not erase the microscopic echoes of trauma embedded in the land itself. Civilians returning to the city encountered the new structures and spaces with mixed feelings. The streets, newly paved and lined with modern amenities, contrasted starkly with the absence of familiar neighbors, the silence of once vibrant communities, and the missing families that had vanished during the massacre. Markets buzzed with trade, children played in reconstructed plazas, and transportation networks pulsed with renewed life. Yet shadows of memory persisted. Elders whispered to their grandchildren about the old houses that once stood there, parents carried the ache of lost children, and survivors walked the streets with eyes trained to notice the subtle reminders of what had been destroyed. The city was alive again, yet haunted, a concrete skeleton rising over the ghosts of its past. The process of reconstruction prioritized efficiency over commemoration. The US and Philippine authorities invested in public works, roads, utilities, and housing, aiming to restore Manila as a functioning capital and port city. Funding, labor, and political attention went into rebuilding essential infrastructure, but little was allocated for memorials, historical preservation, or acknowledgement of the scale of civilian suffering. In this way, Manila's renewal was simultaneously a triumph of engineering and a conscious act of selective forgetting, covering the massacres, bombings, and atrocities with the trappings of progress. Even cultural institutions that survived the siege were affected. Churches which had already been gutted and looted were reconstructed with simplified facades and modern materials. Libraries and archives, many of which had been destroyed entirely, were replaced with new buildings, containing fragments of knowledge and heritage, but lacking the centuries of accumulated history. Museums were established, but often prioritized colonial or pre-war displays, rather than documenting the destruction and civilian suffering of 1945. In effect, the city's memory was being rewritten alongside its streets, a sanitized narrative of rebirth overshadowing the raw reality of the siege. The Pasig River, which had carried the blackened waters and floating corpses, was dredged and cleaned, its banks lined with new embankments, roads, and recreational spaces. Bridges, once twisted and collapsed, were reconstructed with reinforced steel, their modern designs a stark contrast to the Spanish colonial architecture they had replaced. Even as life returned to the waterfront, the river carried beneath it the sediment of countless lives lost, an invisible testimony to the city's trauma. Every building erected, every street paved, and every bridge repaired was built atop the memory of the dead, whether acknowledged or ignored. Psychologically, the city's reconstruction mirrored a form of collective denial. Survivors, facing the enormous task of rebuilding homes, businesses, and community structures, had little time to grieve publicly. Trauma was internalized, personal, and often unspoken, and the physical rebuilding of Manila offered a coping mechanism to impose order, utility, and visible signs of life over the chaos and horror that had scarred the landscape. Children born after the siege grew up amid a city that was superficially whole, yet whose streets, foundations, and riverbanks retained the invisible imprint of atrocity. The contrast between surface prosperity and buried tragedy created a city of dual realities: above ground, concrete, glass, and commerce; below ground, bone dust, remnants of human suffering, and the faint echoes of screams that had once filled the air. The physical reconstruction allowed Manila to resume its role as the capital, a hub of trade, governance, and culture. But the past remained embedded in the city itself, a silent testimony to what had been lost, a memory that could not be fully reconstructed or replaced. In this way, Manila's post-war resurrection was both miraculous and haunting. The city rose again, concrete replacing coral stone, glass replacing stained glass, streets bustling with life and energy. Yet beneath every foundation, every paved road, and every new building lay the residue of its darkest days, a layer of human sacrifice, suffering, and death. The city's renewal was a form of survival, yet it also embodied a pretense, a collective forgetting that the dead were gone but not absent. The reconstruction of a ghost, therefore, was not merely a physical process. It was a moral and psychological negotiation, an effort to create life atop ruin, while simultaneously attempting to move past the overwhelming trauma of urban slaughter. Manila had returned to existence, but it carried within it the invisible scars of 1945, silently reminding every passerby that beneath the veneer of progress lay the bones and dust of a city that had burned, drowned, and suffered beyond measure. As the decades stretched into years and then generations, the siege of Manila gradually receded from the broader currents of global memory. The sheer scale of civilian suffering, the massacres, the firestorms that had consumed half the city, and the deliberate cruelty of the occupying forces became footnotes in history books that often preferred the sanitized language of military strategy, liberation, and heroism. Descriptions softened into phrases like urban combat or collateral damage, reducing months of agony, death, and terror to abstract terms that could be taught in a paragraph or summarized in a textbook chart. The narratives that survived focused on military maneuvers, tactical victories, and General MacArthur's triumphant return, leaving little room for the stories of women, children, and families whose lives had been obliterated. Memorials were few and understated. Plaques marking mass graves or the locations of massacres were modest, almost anonymous, tucked into corners of plazas, churchyards, or alongside reconstructed streets. The vast scale of death, tens of thousands of civilians, could not be fully represented in stone or bronze, and the fragments of remembrance that existed were often overshadowed by the city's focus on reconstruction, modernization, and commerce. Surviving families, still grappling with grief, sometimes marked their own memorials, small shrines in hidden corners, personal acts of remembrance that went largely unnoticed by the wider public. In many cases, the sites of the worst atrocities, schools, hospitals, convents, and neighborhoods, were demolished, rebuilt, or repurposed, erasing visible traces of horror and leaving only faint memories carried in stories passed down through family lines. Tourists wandering through the narrow streets of Intramuros, the reconstructed plazas, and the gleaming modern skyline rarely perceive the layers of history buried beneath their feet. They see the cobblestones, the colonial architecture, and the cultural charm that has been restored, but they do not know that every street once ran red with blood, that churches that now gleam with new facades were gutted by fire, and that the city's foundations rest atop ash, rubble, and the remains of the dead. Beneath the surface of beauty, beneath the restored walls and shiny windows, lies a city scarred by unrecorded suffering, where memory persists only in fragments of whispered stories and surviving photographs. For survivors, this silence was double-edged. On one hand, the fading of public attention allowed them to live without the constant reopening of trauma. On the other, the absence of acknowledgement, the lack of memorialization on a national or global scale, reinforced a sense of isolation, as if the horrors they had endured were unworthy of lasting recognition. Many spoke quietly, in private, to their children or grandchildren, but the broader society often preferred the comforting narrative of resilience, recovery, and progress, leaving the depth of civilian suffering unacknowledged. Historians who did address the siege of Manila often faced challenges of documentation. Much of the archival evidence had been destroyed in the firestorms, and eyewitness accounts were scattered, fragmented, or fading with time. The enormity of civilian casualties, the deliberate atrocities in schools, hospitals, and convents, and the indiscriminate fire that had leveled neighborhoods were difficult to quantify fully. As a result, scholarly treatments of the event tended to emphasize military strategy, liberation narratives, and the eventual rebuilding, further contributing to a collective forgetting. In this way, Manila's past became a city of echoes. The streets, bridges, and riverbanks, rebuilt and bustling with life, carried only faint whispers of their previous history. Survivors passed on fragmented memories. Plaques, markers, and small memorials stood as isolated reminders. Textbooks offered only softened accounts. The vivid horror of the siege, the fire, the massacres, the suffering of tens of thousands of civilians, slowly faded from public consciousness. The city's beauty, restored and polished, was like a veil over the trauma, a reconstructed surface concealing the scars of human cruelty and wartime devastation. Even as Manila grew, modernized, and regained its status as a cultural and economic hub, the silence persisted. Few outside the Philippines were aware of the depth of the suffering endured in 1945. Within the city, the memory was preserved primarily by the elderly, by families, and by scholars dedicated to recording what had been nearly erased. The siege of Manila remained a quiet wound in history, present yet largely invisible, devastating yet sanitized, a chapter whispered in shadows rather than proclaimed in the light. The city lived, yet it remembered. The silence of history was not complete erasure, but a quiet, persistent testimony, a reminder that beneath the bustling streets, beneath the glass and concrete of modern Manila, lay the memory of fire, blood, and sacrifice, waiting for those who chose to see. Even decades after the guns fell silent and the fires of liberation were extinguished, Manila continued to breathe as a city of contradictions, a place where resilience and memory intertwined. In the quiet corners of the rebuilt capital, small altars and candles flickered in remembrance, tended by families who had survived the siege or by descendants who carried the stories forward. In some neighborhoods, elderly survivors would pause on certain streets or plazas, tracing the outlines of buildings that no longer existed, recounting the whispers of lives lost to a generation that could only imagine the scale of suffering. These acts, humble yet profound, kept alive the memory of a city that had been both destroyed and saved. The walls of Intramuros, restored but still scarred in subtle ways, seemed to hum with their own history. They had once confined soldiers, trapped civilians, and witnessed atrocities that defied comprehension. Now they stood as silent sentinels, telling their story to anyone willing to listen. A breeze across the Pasig carried faint echoes of the past, the cries of families fleeing, the thunder of artillery, the roar of fire consuming what had taken centuries to build. Even the river, now cleared and flowing again, held a spectral memory of the blackened currents that had once carried death downstream, reminding the living that history is layered and unyielding. Modern Manila thrives amid its shadows, markets bustle, skyscrapers gleam, and children play where debris once lay. Yet beneath every foundation, every street, every bridge, the past remains interwoven with the present. The city remembers the fire and the blood, the screams and the courage, not as an abstraction but as a living memory encoded into its very stones and soil. The quiet remembrance, candles, whispered stories, plaques tucked away in courtyards, is a testament to a city that refuses to forget, even as the world beyond moves on. Manila's endurance is not only physical but moral. It is a city that survived the extremes of human cruelty, a city that saw freedom arrive cloaked in fire and death, yet still rose again. Its serenity is haunted, its streets alive with the ghosts of the past, a vivid reminder that liberation can be both salvation and destruction. Those who walk through its avenues may glimpse only the beauty of a restored city, but for those who listen closely, the city speaks of resilience, suffering, and the memory of a time when life and death burned with the same relentless flame. In the end, Manila stands not merely as a capital or a commercial hub, but as a living memorial. It is a city where history cannot be entirely silenced, where memory endures in shadows, in foundations, and in the hearts of those who remember. The Pearl of the Orient, though scarred and rebuilt, carries within it the indelible flame of its past, a reminder that freedom, when forged in fire, leaves both beauty and ruin in its wake, and that a city can survive, yet still remember, for all time.